The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of the Metropolitan Club in downtown Chicago, their light reflecting off champagne glasses and designer jewelry. Everything about Madison's wedding reception screamed perfection, from the imported Italian roses to the string quartet playing in the corner. I stood near the bar, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching my younger sister hold court among Chicago's legal elite in her $1,000 Vera Wang gown. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Rebecca Chen, and at 32 I had just experienced what would become the most humiliating night of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that it was happening in a room full of lawyers and judges, people who were supposed to value truth and justice above all else. Madison had always been the golden child of the Chen family. Even now, at 28, she commanded attention effortlessly. Her sleek black hair was pulled into an elegant updo, diamond earrings catching the light as she gestured animatedly, while telling her guests about her meteoric rise at Morrison, Klein & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious corporate law firms. She had made partner just 6 months ago, the youngest person in the firm's history to achieve that distinction. Meanwhile, I stood in the shadows wearing a simple black dress from Target, feeling like an imposter among the Armani suits and Louboutin heels. To everyone in this room, I was Rebecca Chen, the family disappointment who worked as a night janitor at various office buildings around the city. The sister who had dropped out of law school after 1 semester, unable to handle the pressure and competition. Rebecca. Madison's voice cut through the ambient chatter as she approached a group of her law school friends. Her smile was bright and practiced, the same one she used in court when she was about to destroy an opponent's argument. I want you to meet some of my colleagues. The group turned toward me with polite interest, their expressions shifting subtly as they took in my discount store attire and nervous posture. I recognized the look immediately. The barely concealed pity mixed with uncomfortable awkwardness that people display when forced to acknowledge someone beneath their social status. This is my older sister Rebecca, Madison continued, her voice carrying just enough projection to attract nearby conversations. She works in building maintenance downtown, very hardworking, very reliable. The words stung, but it was the tone that cut deepest. Madison spoke about my supposed job the way someone might describe a pet's amusing trick, with condescending affection that made it clear she considered my existence quaint, but ultimately insignificant. That's wonderful, said Jennifer Walsh, one of Madison's law school classmates who now worked at a federal prosecutor's office. Her smile was painfully forced. Honest work is so important. The phrase honest work hung in the air like a judgment. It was the kind of thing people said when they couldn't think of anything genuinely positive to say about someone's career. It implied that while my work might be morally acceptable, it certainly wasn't impressive or worthy of real respect. Rebecca always took a more practical approach to life, Madison continued, and I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't casual conversation. She was building up to something. While I was struggling through the bar exam and those brutal first years at Morrison Klein, she found steady employment that doesn't require the stress and pressure of professional competition. Around us, the conversation had begun to attract attention. Other wedding guests were drifting closer, drawn by Madison's animated storytelling. I recognized several faces from Chicago's legal community: judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, law professors. These were people whose respect and recognition meant everything in this city's legal circles. Not everyone is cut out for the demands of legal practice, Madison went on, her voice growing warmer as she warmed to her theme. It takes a certain type of person to handle the pressure, the long hours, the constant intellectual challenges. Some people are just happier with simpler, more straightforward work. I caught sight of our father across the room. Judge William Chen sat at the head table, his distinguished silver hair perfectly styled, his black robes replaced tonight by an expensive tuxedo. At 62, he commanded respect wherever he went in Chicago's legal community. As a sitting judge on the Illinois Appellate Court, his opinions carried weight far beyond his courtroom. But right now he was nodding along with Madison's presentation of my supposed inadequacy, his expression one of resigned disappointment. The same look he'd worn at family dinners for years whenever my name came up in conversation. The look that said he'd long ago accepted that one of his daughters was simply destined for mediocrity. The important thing is that Rebecca found her place, our father had said during his toast earlier in the evening. Not everyone can achieve the heights that Madison has reached, but we all contribute in our own way. Those words had felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Here was the man who had inspired my love of law, who had read me Supreme Court decisions as bedtime stories when I was a child, dismissing me as someone who simply couldn't measure up to his expectations. "I actually think there's something admirable about accepting your limitations," said Thomas Brennan, a senior partner at another major firm. His tone was meant to be kind, but it carried the unconscious arrogance of someone who had never questioned his own privilege. Too many people chase after careers they're not suited for. Rebecca clearly knows herself well. The group murmured agreement, and I felt heat rising in my cheeks. Not embarrassment, something much more dangerous, pure, crystallized rage. Madison beamed at the positive response to her character assassination. She had successfully positioned herself as the compassionate sister who protected her less capable sibling from the harsh realities of competitive professional life. In her narrative, I wasn't a failure. I was someone who had wisely chosen mediocrity over the risk of attempting greatness and falling short. "Of course, I try to help when I can," Madison continued, reaching into her purse. "Rebecca, I meant to give this to you earlier." She pulled out an envelope and handed it to me with a flourish that ensured everyone nearby could see the exchange. "Just a little something to help with your expenses. I know things can be tight on a service worker's salary." The envelope was thick, obviously containing cash. The gesture was meant to appear generous, but it was actually the final stroke of my public humiliation. Madison was literally giving me charity money in front of a room full of Chicago's most powerful lawyers, cementing my status as the family charity case who required financial assistance from her successful younger sister. "Madison, you don't need to," I started, but she cut me off with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "Don't be silly. Family takes care of family." She turned back to her audience with a self-satisfied smile. "I just want to make sure Rebecca knows she's valued, even if her contributions aren't as visible as some of ours." The condescension was breathtaking. Madison had just told a room full of legal professionals that my work was essentially invisible, unimportant enough that it barely registered as a real contribution to society. She had reduced me to the role of grateful recipient of her largesse, someone whose very survival depended on the charity of more successful family members. Jennifer Walsh nodded approvingly. "You're such a good sister, Madison. It's wonderful that you look out for her." "Rebecca has always needed a little extra support," Madison replied, her voice dripping with false concern. "She's never quite had the drive or ambition that success requires in today's competitive world. But she's family, and we love her exactly as she is." The phrase "exactly as she is" was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. It implied that I was a fixed quantity, someone whose limitations were permanent and unchangeable. In Madison's narrative, I wasn't someone who had faced setbacks or chosen a different path. I was simply someone who lacked the fundamental qualities necessary for real achievement. Around us, the conversation began to shift toward other topics, but the damage was done. I had been publicly categorized as the family's charity case, the disappointing older sister who required financial assistance and emotional management from her more successful sibling. In a room full of Chicago's legal elite, I had been definitively marked as someone who didn't belong, someone whose presence was tolerated out of family obligation rather than earned through merit or accomplishment. As the group began to disperse, Madison caught my arm and leaned in close. "Don't look so serious, Becca," she whispered, using the childhood nickname that now felt like another small cruelty. "This is supposed to be a celebration. Try to enjoy yourself." But as she walked away, her designer heels clicking confidently across the marble floor, I caught something in her expression that made my blood run cold. This hadn't been casual conversation or even unconscious condescension. Madison had deliberately orchestrated my humiliation in front of the most important people in Chicago's legal community. She had systematically destroyed my reputation and credibility among the very people whose respect would matter most in my actual career. The question that burned in my mind was simple: why? Why had my sister chosen her wedding night to so thoroughly and publicly demolish any possibility of my being taken seriously by Chicago's legal establishment? As I stood there clutching her envelope of charity money, watching her glide effortlessly between groups of admiring colleagues, I realized that Madison hadn't just been showing off her generosity tonight. She had been eliminating competition. In her mind, there was only room for one successful Chen daughter in Chicago's legal world, and she was making absolutely certain that everyone knew which one it was. What Madison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her carefully constructed narrative was about to collide with a truth that would shake the very foundations of everything they believed about success, merit, and the real distribution of power in America's legal system. But for now, I stood in the shadows of her perfect wedding reception, absorbing every cruel word and dismissive glance, storing them all away for what was about to become a reckoning 5 years in the making. The truth was far more complex than anyone in that ballroom could have imagined. While Madison basked in the admiration of Chicago's legal elite, I retreated to the ladies' room to compose myself, catching my reflection in the ornate mirrors that lined the walls. The woman staring back at me bore little resemblance to the timid janitor Madison had just presented to her guests. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My real name wasn't just Rebecca Chen. It was Rebecca Chen, Chief Clerk to Associate Justice Elena Rodriguez at the Supreme Court of the United States. For the past 7 years, I had worked in the most powerful judicial building in America, helping to shape decisions that affected millions of lives. The janitor's story was a carefully constructed cover that had protected not only my privacy, but the integrity of the court itself. The deception had started innocently enough. After graduating summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, I had been selected for one of the most coveted positions in American jurisprudence, a Supreme Court clerkship. But unlike most clerks who serve for a single term before moving on to prestigious law firms or academic positions, I had been asked to stay. Justice Rodriguez had requested that I become her permanent chief clerk, a position that existed in the shadows but wielded enormous influence over the direction of American constitutional law. The work required absolute discretion. As chief clerk, I didn't just research legal precedents and draft preliminary opinions. I served as Justice Rodriguez's primary strategic advisor, helping her navigate the complex political dynamics that shaped the court's decisions. I analyzed voting patterns, predicted how different justices would respond to various legal arguments, and helped craft opinions that could secure crucial swing votes on landmark cases. More importantly, I had become Justice Rodriguez's primary liaison with other chambers. When the court needed to build consensus on controversial decisions, I was often the person who conducted the delicate negotiations between justices' staffs. My work required not just legal brilliance, but political acumen and the ability to operate completely outside public view. The position came with extraordinary privileges and terrifying responsibilities. I had security clearance that allowed me access to cases involving national security. I attended private conferences where justices discussed their preliminary thoughts on cases that would reshape American law. I knew how votes would fall on major decisions weeks or sometimes months before the public announcements that sent shockwaves through the political establishment. But the work also demanded total anonymity. Supreme Court clerks traditionally kept low profiles, but my role required something approaching invisibility. Justice Rodriguez had made it clear from the beginning that my effectiveness depended on my ability to operate without attracting attention from the media, political operatives, or ambitious lawyers who might try to influence the court's decisions through back-channel pressure. The cover story had been my own idea. When family and old friends asked about my work after Harvard, I had initially tried vague explanations about research positions and legal consulting. But the questions persisted, and the attention made me uncomfortable. I needed something that would satisfy curiosity while discouraging follow-up inquiries. The janitor's story was perfect. It explained my irregular hours, my reluctance to discuss work details, and my apparent lack of professional advancement. More importantly, it discouraged the kind of social networking that could have compromised my position. No one wanted to cultivate professional relationships with a building maintenance worker, which meant no one dug deeper into my actual circumstances. Over the years, the deception had become increasingly elaborate. I maintained a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, the kind of place where a janitor might reasonably live. When the family visited, they saw secondhand furniture and discount store decorations. My real home was a brownstone in Georgetown, but that remained completely hidden from anyone in Chicago. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic when visiting family, while my actual car was a BMW that stayed parked in Washington. I shopped at Target and wore clothes from discount retailers during family gatherings, while my professional wardrobe consisted of suits from Brooks Brothers and shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The financial aspect had been surprisingly easy to manage. My Supreme Court salary was substantial, but I had set up automatic transfers that moved most of my income into investment accounts under a trust structure that my family couldn't access or even discover. To them, I appeared to live paycheck to paycheck, occasionally needing small loans or gifts to cover unexpected expenses. The emotional cost had been far more difficult to bear. Watching my father's disappointment grow year after year, seeing Madison's condescension increase as her own career flourished, enduring the pitying looks from extended family members who viewed me as the Chen daughter, who had failed to live up to the family's legal legacy. Every family gathering became an exercise in self-denial, forcing myself to accept criticism and concern that was based on a complete fiction. The irony was particularly bitter given our family's legal background. Judge Chen had spent his entire career championing the importance of truth in the justice system. He had built his reputation on careful analysis of evidence and rigorous adherence to legal principles. Yet when it came to his own daughter, he had accepted the most superficial story without any real investigation or curiosity about the details. Madison's rise at Morrison, Klein & Associates had made the situation even more complicated. As she gained prominence in Chicago's legal community, she had begun making connections that sometimes intersected with my real work. Several times, I had found myself in the awkward position of knowing more about cases her firm was handling than she did, having read preliminary briefs or draft opinions that wouldn't be released for months. There had been close calls. Last year, Madison had mentioned working on a case that involved federal constitutional questions that I knew the Supreme Court was likely to review. I had bitten my tongue when she confidently made incorrect predictions about how the court would rule, knowing that Justice Rodriguez had already indicated her likely position during our private discussions. The most difficult moment had come 6 months ago when Madison attended a legal conference in Washington. She had called me excitedly, saying she was going to tour the Supreme Court building and wouldn't it be funny if she ran into someone who looked like me among all the tourists and cleaning staff. I had spent that entire day working from Justice Rodriguez's private office, reviewing drafts of an opinion that would be announced the following month, while my sister wandered the public areas of the building completely unaware that her supposedly unsuccessful sister was 3 floors above her, helping to shape the constitutional law she practiced every day. The psychological toll of maintaining the deception had grown heavier over the years. I had developed elaborate systems to avoid situations where my cover might be compromised. I couldn't attend legal conferences, couldn't publish articles in law reviews under my own name, couldn't accept speaking invitations or awards that might have enhanced my professional reputation in conventional ways. More painfully, I had been forced to decline social invitations that might have led to meaningful relationships. Dating had become nearly impossible, as I couldn't explain my real work or lifestyle to potential partners without violating the discretion requirements of my position. I had watched Madison build a social circle, filled with ambitious, successful professionals, while I maintained careful isolation to protect my secret. The work itself had been extraordinarily fulfilling. Over 7 years, I had contributed to decisions that expanded voting rights, strengthened environmental protections, and clarified the constitutional boundaries of federal power. Justice Rodriguez often credited our collaboration with helping her craft some of her most influential opinions. Legal scholars would someday study those decisions without ever knowing that a supposedly failed law school dropout had played a crucial role in their development. But the professional satisfaction came at enormous personal cost. I had sacrificed relationships, social connections, and family respect to serve in a role that required complete anonymity. While Madison built her reputation through high-profile cases and media appearances, I had helped shape the fundamental legal principles that governed American society while remaining completely invisible. The Supreme Court pin that I wore, hidden beneath my jacket tonight, had been a gift from Justice Rodriguez on my 5th anniversary as her chief clerk. It was a simple gold pin bearing the court's seal, the kind of recognition that only a handful of people in American history had ever received. To most people, it would look like a piece of costume jewelry, but to anyone who understood the Supreme Court's internal operations, it represented a level of trust and responsibility that no amount of law firm partnership could match. As I stood in that bathroom, listening to the sounds of Madison's wedding reception continuing in the ballroom beyond, I reflected on the bitter irony of my situation. My sister had spent the evening presenting me as someone who lacked the ambition and capability for legal success. She had no idea that her supposed failure of a sister had spent the day before her wedding reviewing draft language for a decision that would reshape corporate liability law for decades to come. The hardest part wasn't the humiliation or even Madison's cruelty. It was the growing certainty that this deception could not continue indefinitely. My work at the Supreme Court was becoming increasingly visible within legal circles, even if my name never appeared in public. Justice Rodriguez was nearing retirement, and when that happened, my role would inevitably change in ways that might make maintaining my cover impossible. Tonight, as I prepared to return to the ballroom and endure more condescending sympathy from Madison's guests, I found myself wondering if the time had finally come to let the truth emerge. The question was no longer whether I could continue living this double life, but whether I was ready to face the consequences of revealing exactly who Rebecca Chen really was. When I returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The evening's entertainment was in full swing, with couples dancing to the elegant string quartet while others clustered around cocktail tables, engaged in animated conversation. But I noticed something troubling. Madison was actively working the room, and everywhere she went, she seemed to be continuing her narrative about her charitable relationship with her underachieving sister. I watched from the periphery as she approached different groups, always managing to steer conversations toward family dynamics and the importance of supporting relatives who hadn't been as fortunate in their career paths. Each time, she would gesture in my direction with a combination of affection and pity that made my skin crawl. Rebecca has always been more comfortable in supporting roles, I overheard her telling a cluster of federal prosecutors. Some people are natural leaders, and others prefer to follow. There's nothing wrong with that. The world needs all types. The comment stung because it revealed something deeper about Madison's perception of our relationship. In her mind, I wasn't just professionally unsuccessful. I was fundamentally lacking in leadership qualities, ambition, and drive. She had constructed an entire personality profile for me, based on the cover story I had been forced to maintain, and that profile painted me as someone who actively chose mediocrity over excellence. Judge Patricia Morrison, a family court judge who had known our father for decades, approached me during a lull in the evening's activities. Her expression was kind, but tinged with the sort of concern that successful people reserve for those they perceive as struggling. "Rebecca, dear, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I think it's wonderful how Madison looks out for you," she said, her voice low and confidential. "Not every family maintains those bonds when there are such different levels of achievement involved." The assumption underlying her comment was breathtaking. Judge Morrison had automatically categorized Madison and me into different tiers of human worth, based solely on our apparent professional circumstances. In her worldview, Madison's success created an obligation to care for her less capable sister, and my acceptance of that charity demonstrated appropriate humility and gratitude. "Family is important," I managed to reply, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Absolutely, and you should be proud of the work you do. Honest labor has its own dignity, regardless of the salary or prestige involved." Judge Morrison patted my arm with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for children or elderly relatives. Not everyone can handle the pressures of legal practice. It takes a special constitution. As she walked away, I found myself wondering what Judge Morrison would say if she knew that I had spent the previous week helping Justice Rodriguez draft language for a decision that would overturn a line of family court precedents Morrison had been following for years. The constitutional analysis I had contributed would reshape how family courts across the country handled custody disputes involving military families, affecting thousands of cases annually. The evening continued with a series of increasingly painful interactions. Madison's law school friends approached me with carefully modulated curiosity, asking polite questions about my work that barely concealed their uncomfortable fascination with someone who had so dramatically underperformed relative to her family's expectations. "Do you enjoy the janitorial work?" asked David Park, a federal public defender who clearly meant well but whose tone suggested he was speaking to someone with limited intellectual capacity. "I imagine it must be satisfying to see immediate results from your efforts." The question revealed how people conceptualized menial labor as work suitable only for those who couldn't handle complex thinking or abstract problem-solving. In David's mind, I required the simple satisfaction of visible, concrete accomplishments because I lacked the intellectual sophistication to find meaning in more nuanced professional challenges. "It has its rewards," I replied carefully, thinking about how that morning I had identified a critical gap in legal precedent that Justice Rodriguez was now considering for a future opinion. The intellectual satisfaction of that discovery had been profound, but I could never explain to David that some of the most important legal work in America was being done by someone he viewed as cognitively limited. The most difficult conversation came when I encountered Michael Chang, a law professor at Northwestern who specialized in constitutional law. Professor Chang had been one of my references when I applied for my Supreme Court clerkship, though he had no knowledge of my current role or the evolution of my career since Harvard. "Rebecca Chen," he said, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure, "I haven't seen you since law school. What brings you to such an elegant gathering?" My heart stopped. Here was someone who knew my real academic record, who had taught me constitutional law, and recommended me for positions that led directly to my current role. If anyone could blow my cover simply through casual conversation, it was Professor Chang. "Madison is my sister," I said quickly, hoping to redirect the conversation before he could ask about my current work. "Your sister?" Of course I should have seen the family resemblance. "She's making quite a name for herself in corporate law. And what have you been up to? Please tell me you're using that brilliant legal mind of yours." The moment hung in the air like a sword. Professor Chang remembered me as one of his most promising students, someone whose constitutional law analysis had impressed him enough to write glowing recommendations. He was expecting to hear about a career trajectory that matched my academic achievements. Before I could formulate a response that might preserve my cover without outright lying to a former mentor, Madison appeared at my elbow with perfect timing and devastating effect. "Professor Chang, how wonderful that you remember Rebecca." Her smile was radiant, but I could see calculation in her eyes. "I'm afraid she ended up taking a very different path than law school might have suggested. Sometimes the academic environment doesn't translate well to real-world pressures." Professor Chang looked confused, his gaze shifting between Madison and me as he tried to reconcile his memories of my academic performance with Madison's implication that I had somehow failed to succeed in legal practice. "Rebecca was one of my strongest constitutional law students," he said carefully. "Her analysis of Commerce Clause jurisprudence was graduate-level work. I assumed she would end up in appellate practice or maybe academia." Madison's laugh was light and musical, but I heard the edge beneath it. "Well, sometimes our expectations don't align with reality." Rebecca discovered that the pressures of legal practice weren't really suited to her temperament. She's found her niche in more practical work now, building maintenance and cleaning services. It's honest work, and she seems much happier without the stress of competitive legal environments. I watched Professor Chang's face as he processed this information. The confusion deepened, tinged now with something that looked like concern. In his experience, students with my academic record didn't typically abandon legal careers for janitorial work unless something had gone seriously wrong. "I see," he said slowly, his tone suggesting he didn't see at all. "Well, I hope you're finding fulfillment in whatever path you've chosen, Rebecca." The pity in his voice was unmistakable. Here was a professor who had invested time and energy in developing my legal thinking, who had believed enough in my potential to stake his professional reputation on recommendation letters, now confronted with evidence that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. As Professor Chang moved away, clearly troubled by the encounter, Madison leaned close to me with satisfaction evident in her expression. "You looked a little overwhelmed there," she said with false concern. "I hope Professor Chang wasn't making you uncomfortable with all those questions about your academic work. Some people have trouble letting go of past expectations." The cruelty was breathtaking. Madison had deliberately sabotaged a conversation with someone who had been important to my real career development, ensuring that Professor Chang would remember me, not as a promising student who had succeeded beyond his expectations, but as a disappointing failure whose academic potential had never translated into professional achievement. But the encounter had revealed something else that made my blood run cold. Madison's intervention hadn't been spontaneous. She had been monitoring my conversations throughout the evening, ready to reinforce her narrative whenever anyone expressed surprise or curiosity about my supposed career trajectory. This wasn't casual condescension or thoughtless superiority. It was a systematic campaign to ensure that anyone who might remember me differently would have their perceptions corrected according to Madison's preferred version of reality. As the evening progressed, I began to notice other troubling patterns. Madison had strategically seated me at a table with her least impressive guests, a mix of distant relatives and plus ones, who wouldn't ask challenging questions or have expectations about my background. Meanwhile, she had populated the head table and surrounding areas with Chicago's most influential legal figures, ensuring maximum visibility for her own achievements while keeping me safely quarantined among people who wouldn't matter to my professional reputation. Even more calculated was her gift-giving performance. Throughout the reception, I watched Madison present various wedding gifts to guests with elaborate ceremony, thanking major clients and referring partners with public displays of gratitude that reinforced her professional relationships. But when it came to my gift, a modestly priced crystal vase that had represented a significant expense on my supposed janitor's salary, Madison had opened it privately and set it aside without comment, clearly considering it too insignificant to warrant public acknowledgement. The message was clear. My presence at her wedding was tolerated out of family obligation, but my contributions were too minimal to deserve recognition among her important guests. I was being systematically marginalized and diminished, not through oversight or accident, but through careful orchestration designed to reinforce everyone's assumptions about my place in the family hierarchy. As midnight approached and the reception began winding down, I found myself standing near the entrance to the ballroom's private terrace, wondering if I could simply slip away without enduring any more of Madison's charitable attention. The evening had been far worse than I had anticipated, not just because of the personal humiliation, but because of the growing realization that Madison's behavior tonight represented years of accumulated resentment and calculated malice. But as I prepared to make my escape, I noticed a figure approaching through the crowd that made my pulse quicken with an entirely different kind of anxiety. Justice Sandra Blackwood, recently appointed to the Illinois Supreme Court, was walking directly toward me with an expression of focused curiosity that suggested she had been observing the evening's dynamics with the analytical eye that had made her one of the state's most respected jurists. Justice Blackwood was someone I knew by reputation from my work at the federal level, though we had never been formally introduced. More importantly, she was exactly the kind of legal mind who might piece together inconsistencies in my cover story if she applied the same rigorous analysis to my personal circumstances that she brought to her judicial decisions. As she approached, I realized that the most dangerous moment of the entire evening was about to unfold, a conversation with someone who had both the legal sophistication to see through deceptions and the professional connections to verify suspicious details about my supposed career trajectory. Justice Sandra Blackwood moved through the crowd with the measured grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. At 58, she possessed the kind of intellectual presence that made conversations pause when she approached. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her navy blue dress was understated but clearly expensive, the uniform of someone whose authority came from competence rather than ostentation. As she drew closer, I felt my carefully constructed world beginning to tilt on its axis. Justice Blackwood had built her reputation on meticulous attention to detail. and an almost supernatural ability to identify inconsistencies in legal arguments. If anyone could unravel my cover story through casual conversation, it would be her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had made her oral arguments legendary when she practiced before the Supreme Court. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Sandra Blackwood." "Rebecca Chen," I replied, extending my hand and hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. Justice Blackwood's handshake was firm, but I noticed her eyes studying my face with unusual intensity. "Chen. Are you related to Judge William Chen?" "He's my father." "Of course. I can see the resemblance now." Her smile was polite, but her analytical gaze continued its assessment. "I've had great respect for your father's work on the appellate court. His opinions on constitutional questions have been particularly insightful." I nodded, unsure how to respond without revealing more about my own background than my cover story would support. "And what brings you to this lovely celebration?" Justice Blackwood asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Madison is my sister." "Ah, the bride. She's made quite an impression in corporate law circles." Justice Blackwood paused, and I had the distinct feeling she was choosing her next words carefully. "I assume you're also in legal practice, given your family's background?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment I had been dreading, a direct inquiry from someone whose professional life revolved around extracting truth from carefully constructed narratives. Before I could formulate a response that might preserve my cover, Madison appeared with the impeccable timing of someone who had been monitoring the conversation from across the room. "Justice Blackwood, what an honor to have you at our wedding." Madison's professional charm was in full display as she positioned herself between the justice and me. "I see you've met my sister Rebecca. She's the practical one in our family." Justice Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "Practical?" "Rebecca chose a more straightforward career path than the rest of us legal eagles," Madison continued with her now familiar tone of condescending affection. "She works in building maintenance, very steady work, very reliable hours. Not everyone is cut out for the pressures of legal practice." I watched Justice Blackwood's expression carefully as Madison spoke. Something shifted in her eyes. Not the pity or awkward sympathy I had grown accustomed to seeing, but a sharper kind of attention, as if Madison's explanation had raised questions rather than answering them. "Building maintenance," Justice Blackwood repeated slowly. "How interesting. That must give you access to many different professional environments." The comment seemed innocuous, but I heard the probing quality beneath it. Justice Blackwood was testing something, though I wasn't sure what. "Oh yes," Madison answered for me, clearly pleased to elaborate on my supposed limitations. "Rebecca works nights mostly, cleaning office buildings downtown. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. She seems to prefer work that doesn't require too much intellectual engagement." The phrase hit the air like a slap. Madison had just told one of Illinois' most respected jurists that her sister was essentially too simple-minded for complex work. But instead of the understanding nod Madison clearly expected, Justice Blackwood's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I see," she said, her tone neutral but somehow more focused. "And which buildings do you work in, Rebecca?" The question was directed specifically at me, cutting through Madison's attempts to control the narrative. I felt trapped between maintaining my cover and avoiding an outright lie to a sitting judge. "Various locations," I replied carefully. "The assignments change regularly." "Including federal buildings?" Justice Blackwood asked, and now I was certain she was pursuing a specific line of inquiry. Madison laughed, apparently oblivious to the undercurrents in the conversation. "I doubt Rebecca has the security clearance for federal buildings. That would require background checks and all sorts of complicated paperwork. She's more suited to private office buildings. Less complicated, fewer requirements." Justice Blackwood turned to look at Madison with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You seem very informed about your sister's work limitations." There was something in her tone that made Madison pause. For the first time that evening, she seemed to sense that her narrative wasn't being received with the sympathetic understanding she expected. "Well, I just want to be realistic about everyone's capabilities," Madison said, her confidence wavering slightly. "Not everyone can handle high-pressure professional environments. There's no shame in finding your appropriate level." Your appropriate level, Justice Blackwood repeated, and now her tone carried a distinctly skeptical edge. How do you determine someone's appropriate level, Ms. Chen? Madison's smile became strained. I just meant that people have different strengths and limitations. Rebecca has always been more comfortable with simple, straightforward tasks. Simple tasks. Justice Blackwood's attention returned to me with laser focus. Tell me, Rebecca, what's your educational background? The question was a trap. If I claimed limited education, it might satisfy my cover story, but would contradict easily verifiable facts about Judge Chen's family. If I mentioned Harvard, it would raise obvious questions about my current employment. She went to law school briefly, Madison interjected quickly, but it didn't work out. Sometimes the academic environment doesn't translate well to real-world pressures. She's much happier in her current situation. Justice Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. Law school briefly, which school? I felt the walls closing in. Harvard, I said quietly, knowing that the lie of omission was about to become impossible to maintain. Harvard Law School. Justice Blackwood's voice carried a note of surprise that seemed genuine. And you left to pursue janitorial work? Madison stepped forward with renewed confidence, clearly believing she could explain this apparent contradiction. Academic pressure affects people differently. Rebecca found that the competitive environment and intellectual demands were too stressful. She's much better suited to work that doesn't require constant analysis and critical thinking. As Madison spoke, I noticed Justice Blackwood's gaze drift downward, and my heart stopped. She was looking at my jacket, specifically at the small bulge where my Supreme Court pin rested beneath the fabric. Rebecca, Justice Blackwood said carefully, would you mind if I asked you a question about constitutional law? Madison laughed, the sound sharp and nervous. Justice Blackwood, I don't think that's really fair. Rebecca hasn't used any of that academic knowledge in years. She's not current on legal developments. But Justice Blackwood ignored Madison completely, her attention focused entirely on me. The Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine. How would you analyze a state regulation that disproportionately affects interstate commerce while serving a legitimate local purpose? The question hit me like an electric shock. It was exactly the kind of complex constitutional analysis that I dealt with regularly in my work with Justice Rodriguez. More than that, it was directly related to a case currently before the court that wouldn't be decided for months. Madison was staring at Justice Blackwood with undisguised panic. Really, this isn't necessary. Rebecca hasn't studied constitutional law in years. You're just going to embarrass her. But Justice Blackwood's eyes remained locked on mine, and I saw something in them that made my pulse race: recognition. Not the vague familiarity of someone trying to place a face, but the sharp acknowledgement of someone who had just solved a puzzle. Actually, Justice Blackwood said slowly, I think Rebecca is far more current on constitutional law than anyone here realizes. The statement fell into the conversation like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of confusion through the small group that had gathered around us. What do you mean? Madison asked, her voice rising slightly. Justice Blackwood reached into her evening bag and pulled out her phone. I mean that I've been wondering all evening why Rebecca Chen looked so familiar to me. And now I remember where I've seen her before. She held up her phone, displaying what appeared to be a group photo. This was taken 6 months ago at the Federal Judicial Conference in Washington. Do you see anyone you recognize in this picture, Ms. Chen? My blood turned to ice. The photo showed a small group of federal court clerks and staff members who had attended a special briefing on emerging constitutional questions. I was in the background, barely visible but unmistakably present. Madison grabbed the phone, squinting at the screen. I don't understand. What is this? It's a photo from a conference that only Supreme Court staff and federal appellate clerks were authorized to attend, Justice Blackwood said calmly. The kind of conference that someone in building maintenance would have no reason to access. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Madison's mind racing, trying to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about her sister's life. Justice Blackwood continued, her voice growing more certain with each word. In fact, now that I think about it, I believe Rebecca Chen was specifically mentioned during Justice Rodriguez's remarks about the invaluable contributions of senior staff members to the court's constitutional analysis. Madison's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. "That's impossible," she whispered. Justice Blackwood smiled for the first time since approaching us. "Is it? Rebecca, would you mind showing us what's under your jacket?" The question hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be read. Around us, other wedding guests had begun to notice the unusual intensity of our conversation. I could see my father approaching from across the room, his judicial instincts apparently alerting him that something significant was unfolding. Madison was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not just shock, but genuine fear, as if she was finally beginning to understand that the reality of my life might be far different from the carefully constructed narrative she had been using to define our relationship for years. "Rebecca?" Justice Blackwood's voice was gentle but insistent. "I think it's time for the truth, don't you?" The moment stretched like a held breath. Justice Blackwood's request hung in the air while Madison stared at me with mounting dread, finally beginning to comprehend that everything she thought she knew about her sister might be built on quicksand. With trembling fingers, I reached beneath my jacket and withdrew the small gold pin that had remained hidden throughout the evening. The Supreme Court seal caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, its eagle and scales of justice gleaming against the dark fabric of my dress. The reaction was immediate and electric. Justice Blackwood's eyes widened with something approaching awe, while Madison's face drained of all color. But it was my father's response that cut deepest. Judge William Chen had frozen mid-step, his weathered features cycling through shock, confusion, and dawning recognition. "Dear God," Justice Blackwood whispered, "you're Justice Rodriguez's chief clerk." The words fell into the gathering crowd like a bombshell. Wedding guests who had been maintaining polite distance were now pressing closer, drawn by the unmistakable sense that something momentous was unfolding. I caught fragments of whispered conversations as lawyers and judges tried to process what they were witnessing. Madison found her voice first, though it emerged as little more than a croak. "What does that mean? What is a chief clerk?" Justice Blackwood turned to her with an expression that mixed pity with barely concealed disdain. A chief clerk to a Supreme Court justice is one of the most prestigious and influential positions in American jurisprudence. There are fewer than a dozen people in the entire country who hold such positions. They help shape constitutional law at the highest level. "That's impossible," Madison said, her voice growing shriller. "Rebecca cleans office buildings. She dropped out of law school. She works nights for minimum wage." "No," came a voice from behind us. My father had finally reached our circle, and his words carried the weight of judicial authority even in his shock. "She graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School. I remember now, she was accepted for a Supreme Court clerkship, but then she just disappeared. We thought she had failed, that the pressure had been too much. The pieces were falling into place for him with devastating clarity." Judge Chen was remembering details he had pushed aside or rationalized away, viewing them now through the lens of truth rather than disappointment. "You've been living a double life," he continued, his voice filled with wonder and growing horror at his own role in my deception. "For how long?" 7 years, I said quietly. 7 years of letting you all believe I was a failure because my actual work required absolute discretion." Madison was shaking her head frantically, as if she could deny reality through sheer force of will. "This doesn't make sense. Why would you let us think you were a janitor if you had some important job?" Justice Blackwood answered before I could speak. "Because Supreme Court staff operate under extraordinary security protocols. Their identities and roles are protected information. The work they do affects cases worth billions of dollars and shapes constitutional interpretation for generations. The wrong people knowing who they are could compromise the entire judicial system." Professor Chang had materialized beside us, his earlier confusion replaced by dawning amazement. "Rebecca, is this true? You've been working at the Supreme Court this entire time?" I nodded, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified as my carefully constructed walls crumbled around me. "But why didn't you trust us?" Madison demanded, and I could hear genuine hurt beneath her panic. "We're your family." The question hung in the air, and I felt 7 years of suppressed frustration finally break free. Trust you? I asked, my voice growing stronger with each word. Madison, you spent this entire evening systematically humiliating me in front of Chicago's legal elite. You told a room full of judges and prosecutors that I was too simple-minded for intellectual work. You presented me as a charity case who needed your financial support to survive. I was trying to help, she protested weakly. You were trying to maintain your position as the successful sister, I shot back. Every family gathering for 7 years. You've used my supposed failure to make yourself look better by comparison. You've never once asked genuine questions about my life or shown real interest in my well-being. You were too busy being superior. Judge Patricia Morrison had joined the growing circle of observers, her earlier condescension replaced by obvious discomfort. Rebecca, I had no idea. The way Madison presented your situation was exactly what I trained her to believe, I interrupted. But the question is why she was so eager to believe it. Why was it so easy for all of you to accept that Judge William Chen's daughter had become a failure? The accusation hung in the air like an indictment. Around us, the wedding guests were whispering urgently, phones appearing as people began researching Supreme Court staff directories and trying to verify the extraordinary claims they were witnessing. My father stepped forward, his face etched with guilt and dawning understanding. Honey, I'm so sorry. We should have asked more questions. We should have known that something didn't add up. Should you? I challenged him. Or was it easier to believe that one of your daughters was a disappointment? Did it make you feel better about Madison's achievements to think that I had failed so completely? The brutal honesty of the question made several people step back. Judge Chen's distinguished facade cracked, revealing the pain of a man confronting his own failures as a father. Madison found her voice again, but it emerged as desperate pleading rather than confident assertion. I didn't know, you have to understand, I really didn't know. If you had just told me— Told you what? I demanded. That I was sworn to secrecy about work that affects national security? That I had helped draft opinions that would reshape American law? That while you were bragging about making partner at a corporate firm, I was helping decide cases that would be studied in law schools for decades? Justice Blackwood pulled out her phone again, this time displaying what appeared to be an official government directory. Rebecca Chen, Chief Clerk to Associate Justice Elena Rodriguez. 7 years of service, multiple commendations for exceptional contribution to constitutional analysis. She's been recognized by the Department of Justice for her work on cases involving federal jurisdiction and civil rights law. The formal recitation of my actual achievements created a stunned silence. These weren't vague claims or family exaggerations. They were documented accomplishments that could be verified through official channels. Professor Chang shook his head in amazement. The constitutional analysis work. The federal jurisdiction expertise. Rebecca, you've been doing exactly what I thought you would do when I wrote those recommendation letters. You became exactly the kind of legal mind I knew you could be. While letting us treat you like a charity case, Madison whispered, the full scope of her cruelty finally becoming clear to her. While protecting my cover story, I corrected. Madison, the reason I couldn't tell you wasn't just about security protocols. It was about knowing that you would never be able to keep the secret. You would have found a way to make my achievements about yourself. You would have bragged to your friends, posted hints on social media, turned my service into content for your personal brand. Madison opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. We both knew I was right. Her entire social media presence was built on sharing personal stories and family updates. There was no way she could have kept my secret. But the humiliation, Judge Morrison said quietly, making her seem incompetent in front of all these legal professionals, was exactly what I've been doing for years, Madison admitted, her voice breaking. I've been using Rebecca's supposed failure to make myself look better. I thought it was harmless because she really was failing. Harmless? Justice Blackwood's voice carried the sharp edge that had made her legendary in appellate arguments. Ms. Chen, you've spent this evening systematically destroying your sister's reputation among people who should be her professional peers. Some of the judges and lawyers in this room will be arguing cases before the Supreme Court. You may have seriously compromised her ability to do her job effectively. The implications hit Madison like a physical blow. Her campaign to position herself as the successful sister hadn't just been cruel, it had potentially damaged national judicial processes. "I didn't think," she whispered. "No, you didn't think," I agreed. "You never think about anyone but yourself. Tonight you turned your wedding reception into a performance designed to humiliate me in front of the most important legal minds in Chicago. You gave me charity money in front of federal judges. You told constitutional law experts that I was too simple for intellectual work." Judge Chen stepped forward, his voice heavy with paternal authority and deep regret. "Madison, you owe your sister more than an apology. You owe her public acknowledgement of what you've done." Around us, the wedding reception had essentially stopped. Guests were clustered in small groups, their phones out as they frantically researched Supreme Court staff directories and tried to process the extraordinary revelation they had witnessed. The elegant celebration had transformed into something resembling a legal proceeding, with Madison in the defendant's chair facing a jury of Chicago's most respected legal minds. "I don't know how to fix this," Madison said, tears streaming down her face as the full scope of her actions became clear. "You can't fix it," I replied with quiet finality. "You can't undo 7 years of treating me like a failure. You can't take back the things you said tonight in front of these people. You can't erase the damage you've done to my relationships and my professional reputation." The truth hung between us like a verdict, final and irreversible. Madison's perfect wedding night had become the stage for her own public reckoning, and unlike the legal cases she was accustomed to winning, this was a judgment she could neither appeal nor escape. The transformation of the wedding reception was swift and merciless. Within minutes of my revelation, the elegant celebration had morphed into something resembling a legal symposium, with clusters of judges and attorneys engaged in urgent conversations about constitutional law, Supreme Court procedures, and the extraordinary woman they had just discovered in their midst. Madison stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, her designer wedding gown now feeling like a costume from a play that had taken an unexpected and devastating turn. The guests who had spent the evening listening to her condescending descriptions of her simple sister were now approaching me with a mixture of awe, embarrassment, and professional curiosity. Federal District Judge Harold Washington was the first to break ranks with the previous evening's narrative. A distinguished African-American jurist with 30 years on the bench, he approached me with the gravity of someone acknowledging a fellow member of America's most exclusive legal fraternity. "Ms. Chen," he said, extending his hand with genuine respect, "I owe you a profound apology. The work you do at the Supreme Court represents the highest level of judicial service in our nation. The fact that I spent this evening accepting characterizations of you as, well, as anything less than a distinguished legal professional is deeply troubling." His words carried the weight of judicial authority, and I watched as other guests absorbed the implications. Judge Washington wasn't just correcting a social misunderstanding. He was essentially ruling that Madison's behavior had been inappropriate by the standards of legal ethics and professional courtesy. "Judge Washington," I replied carefully, "you had no way of knowing the truth. My cover story was designed to be convincing." "But that's exactly the point," interjected Judge Rebecca Martinez from the Federal Court of Appeals. She had materialized beside Judge Washington with the focused intensity that had made her one of the most respected appellate judges in the Midwest. Supreme Court staff maintain cover stories because their work is sensitive enough to require protection. The fact that your own family was systematically undermining that protection raises serious questions about operational security. The comment hit Madison like a slap. Judge Martinez wasn't just criticizing her personal behavior. She was suggesting that Madison's actions might have compromised federal judicial security protocols. "I didn't know," Madison said weakly, her voice barely audible above the growing conversation around us. "But you should have known better than to publicly humiliate any member of your family," said Dr. Angela Foster, the dean of Northwestern Law School, who had been observing the unfolding drama with academic fascination. "Regardless of Rebecca's actual profession, your behavior tonight displayed a level of cruelty that would be concerning in any context." The academic perspective added another layer to Madison's public trial. Dr. Foster wasn't just commenting as a wedding guest. She was evaluating Madison's conduct through the lens of professional ethics that governed the legal community. Meanwhile, the younger lawyers and law students who had gathered around Madison earlier in the evening were now gravitating toward me with obvious career calculation. Supreme Court clerks were legendary figures in legal circles, and the opportunity to network with a sitting chief clerk was worth far more than association with a corporate law partner, no matter how successful. "Ms. Chen," said Jennifer Walsh, the federal prosecutor who had earlier offered condescending praise for my supposed honest work, "I wonder if I could ask you about the court's approach to Commerce Clause interpretation in digital privacy cases." The question was sophisticated and clearly designed to demonstrate that Jennifer understood the significance of my actual role. But it also highlighted the complete reversal of our earlier interaction. She was now seeking my professional insight rather than offering charitable sympathy for my circumstances. I answered her question with the kind of detailed constitutional analysis that I provided daily in my real work, and I watched the gathering crowd absorb the depth of legal knowledge that Madison had dismissed as impossible just minutes earlier. Professor Chang was documenting the evening's revelations with obvious scholarly excitement. "Rebecca, this is extraordinary. You've been contributing to constitutional jurisprudence at the highest level while maintaining complete anonymity. The discipline required for that kind of operational security is remarkable." His academic enthusiasm provided a stark contrast to Madison's growing isolation. While legal professionals clustered around me with genuine respect and professional curiosity, Madison found herself increasingly alone in the center of her own wedding reception. The social dynamics had shifted with brutal efficiency. Thomas Brennan, the senior law firm partner who had earlier praised Madison for accepting her supposedly limited sister's circumstances, was now studying Madison with obvious discomfort. "I have to say," he announced to no one in particular, "I'm deeply troubled by what we've witnessed tonight. The systematic humiliation of a Supreme Court staff member, regardless of family relationships, reflects poorly on our entire legal community." His statement carried particular weight because Thomas Brennan was known for his conservative approach to professional ethics. If he was publicly criticizing Madison's behavior, it signaled that her actions had crossed lines that even traditionally minded lawyers found unacceptable. The wedding's photographer, who had been capturing moments of celebration throughout the evening, now found herself documenting a very different kind of historical moment. Her camera clicked as she recorded conversations between federal judges and Supreme Court staff, creating images that would eventually become part of a story that legal communities would discuss for years. Madison's new husband, David Park, approached with obvious distress written across his features. As a federal public defender, he understood the significance of Supreme Court positions and the ethical implications of what his new wife had done. "Madison," he said quietly, pulling her aside from the growing crowd, "do you understand what just happened? You publicly humiliated someone whose work affects cases, I argue. Rebecca Chen isn't just your sister. She's one of the most influential people in American constitutional law." Madison's response was a mixture of shock and desperate self-justification. "How was I supposed to know? She never told us anything. She let us believe she was failing." "Because her job required her to let you believe that," David replied with growing frustration. Supreme Court security protocols exist for reasons that go far beyond family dynamics. You may have compromised federal judicial operations because you couldn't resist making yourself look superior. The conversation between Madison and David was attracting attention from nearby guests, who were beginning to understand that the evening's revelations had implications beyond family drama. Federal judicial security wasn't a matter for casual discussion, and the possibility that operational protocols had been compromised was a serious concern. Justice Blackwood, who had initiated the evening's unraveling, now found herself in the position of managing a potential security incident. She approached me with the focused attention of someone dealing with official business rather than social conversation. "Rebecca, I need to ask you some questions about operational security. Has your cover been compromised in other contexts? Are there other family members or social connections who might pose risks to Supreme Court personnel security?" Her questions transformed our conversation from personal drama into official inquiry. Justice Blackwood wasn't just a wedding guest anymore. She was a senior judicial officer investigating potential security breaches that could affect the highest court in the land. The implications rippled through the gathered legal professionals like shockwaves. These weren't just lawyers at a social event anymore. They were potential witnesses to a federal security incident that might require official documentation and follow-up investigation. Madison watched this transformation with mounting horror as she began to understand that her actions might have consequences extending far beyond personal embarrassment. Federal judicial security protocols weren't subject to family forgiveness or social apologies. They were matters of national importance that operated according to rules she had never considered. My father approached Justice Blackwood with the deference of a lower court judge addressing a superior judicial authority. Justice Blackwood, if there are security concerns arising from my family's misunderstanding, I want to assure you that we will cooperate fully with any necessary investigations or protocol reviews. His offer of cooperation highlighted the seriousness of the situation while simultaneously emphasizing Madison's role in creating the potential security problem. Judge Chen was essentially placing his daughter under judicial scrutiny to protect the integrity of federal court operations. The wedding reception continued around us, but it had become something entirely different from the elegant celebration Madison had planned. Guests were now engaged in serious conversations about constitutional law, judicial ethics, and federal security protocols, rather than congratulating the bride on her perfect evening. Madison's carefully orchestrated showcase of her professional success and family superiority had transformed into a public examination of her judgment, character, and fitness for continued participation in Chicago's legal community. The room that had been filled with admiration for her achievements now buzzed with concern about her behavior and its implications for legal professional standards. As the evening wore on, I found myself at the center of conversations that would have been impossible just hours earlier. Federal judges sought my insights on upcoming constitutional questions, law professors discussed potential academic collaborations, and senior practitioners explored opportunities for professional consultation that could benefit from the Supreme Court perspective. Meanwhile, Madison stood increasingly isolated in her wedding gown, watching her perfect evening dissolve into a professional and personal catastrophe that she had created entirely through her own cruel ambitions and willful ignorance of the truth about her sister's extraordinary life. 6 months after that catastrophic wedding night, the consequences had rippled through Chicago's legal community with devastating precision. Madison's career at Morrison Klein & Associates had quietly dissolved when major clients began questioning the judgment of a partner who had publicly humiliated a Supreme Court chief clerk. Corporate law, it turned out, depended heavily on maintaining relationships with federal judicial staff who could influence regulatory decisions and appellate outcomes. Her marriage to David Park had lasted exactly 3 weeks. As a federal public defender, David couldn't afford professional association with someone whose actions had raised questions about judicial security protocols. Their annulment proceedings had become a minor scandal in legal circles, with David's public statement citing fundamental differences in professional ethics and judgment. Madison now worked at a small personal injury firm in suburban Naperville, handling fender-bender cases and slip-and-fall claims, a dramatic fall from her previous position among Chicago's elite corporate lawyers. Her social media presence, once filled with glamorous photos from high-profile legal events, had gone completely silent. Meanwhile, my own life had transformed in ways I could never have anticipated. The revelation of my identity had actually enhanced my effectiveness at the Supreme Court. Justice Rodriguez had been pleased to discover that my cover story's collapse had not compromised our work, but had instead opened new channels for collaboration with lower courts and legal academic institutions. Professor Chang had invited me to deliver the keynote address at Northwestern Law School's Constitutional Law Symposium. Federal judges now consulted with me directly on complex jurisdictional questions, no longer needing to route their inquiries through formal Supreme Court channels. The academic recognition that I had been forced to forego while maintaining my cover was now flowing freely. My father had entered intensive therapy to address his decades of favoritism and willful blindness to his daughter's real achievements. His public apology letter, published in the Chicago Bar Association newsletter, had become a case study in judicial ethics courses about the importance of seeking truth rather than accepting comfortable assumptions. The most profound change had been in my relationship with truth itself. For 7 years, I had allowed my family to define me through their limitations and biases. Madison's cruelty hadn't created my supposed failure. It had revealed her own moral poverty and intellectual laziness. She had been so invested in her superiority narrative that she had never bothered to investigate the reality of my circumstances. The Supreme Court pin that had remained hidden for so long now rested openly on my lapel during professional events. It represented not just my service to American jurisprudence, but my refusal to accept other people's diminished expectations of my worth and capabilities. Madison had taught me an invaluable lesson about the nature of family loyalty and personal integrity. Sometimes the people closest to us are the least capable of seeing our true value, not because we hide it from them, but because recognizing it would require them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Justice had been served not through revenge or elaborate planning, but through the simple act of allowing truth to speak for itself when the moment was right. Madison's downfall had been entirely self-inflicted, the natural consequence of years of cruelty and willful ignorance finally colliding with reality. The ripple effects had extended far beyond my immediate family. Justice Blackwood had initiated a comprehensive review of Supreme Court security protocols, leading to new guidelines about how federal judicial staff should handle family relationships and social exposure. My case had become a teaching moment for the entire federal judiciary about the importance of operational security in an age of social media and instant information sharing. The Chicago legal community had undergone its own reckoning. Several prominent law firms had quietly reviewed their hiring practices after realizing how easily they had been misled by surface appearances and family narratives. The Madison Chen incident, as it came to be known in professional circles, had sparked discussions about unconscious bias, professional assumptions, and the danger of accepting social hierarchies without investigation. Morrison, Klein & Associates had suffered significant reputational damage beyond just losing Madison. Major corporate clients began questioning the firm's judgment and due diligence capabilities. If their youngest partner could so spectacularly misunderstand her own sister's professional status, what other crucial details might the firm be overlooking in their legal analysis? The Federal Judicial Conference had invited me to speak about maintaining professional anonymity while serving in high-security positions. My presentation had become required reading for new Supreme Court clerks and federal court staff, illustrating both the challenges and the importance of operational discretion in sensitive judicial roles. 3 federal judges who had attended the wedding reception had formally commended my service in letters to the Supreme Court's administrative office. Judge Washington's letter specifically noted that my ability to maintain professional composure while enduring systematic humiliation demonstrated exactly the kind of character required for Supreme Court service. My relationship with Justice Rodriguez had deepened beyond professional collaboration. She had become something of a mentor, helping me navigate the transition from complete anonymity to appropriate professional visibility. Together, we had developed protocols for how Supreme Court staff could engage with the broader legal community without compromising security requirements. The academic opportunities had been particularly rewarding. Constitutional law professors across the country were eager to understand how theoretical principles translated into practical judicial decision-making. My insights from 7 years of Supreme Court service had enriched classroom discussions and scholarly research in ways that traditional academic approaches couldn't achieve. The last time I saw Madison was at a coffee shop near the courthouse where I was meeting with Justice Rodriguez about an upcoming case involving interstate commerce regulation. Ironically, the same type of constitutional question she had once dismissed as beyond my intellectual capacity. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of the arrogance that had once defined her presence. Her expensive designer wardrobe had been replaced by conservative business attire appropriate for suburban personal injury practice. The confident stride that had carried her through corporate boardrooms had become hesitant, uncertain. She started to approach my table, then stopped, apparently recognizing that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. I saw her mouth form the beginning of what might have been Rebecca, but no sound emerged. Instead, she turned away, her shoulders slumped with the weight of consequences she had never imagined when she chose cruelty over curiosity about her sister's real life. Justice Rodriguez noticed the brief interaction. "Someone you know?" she asked gently. "Someone I used to know," I replied, watching Madison disappear into the crowd of downtown professionals who would never again see her as the rising star she had once been. As I walked away that day, I realized that forgiveness wasn't always necessary for justice to be complete. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply to continue excelling while refusing to accept anyone else's limitations as your own truth. Madison had spent years trying to diminish my worth to elevate her own status, never understanding that genuine achievement doesn't require stepping on others to reach greater heights. The Supreme Court pin on my lapel caught the afternoon sunlight as I headed back to Chambers, where constitutional questions waited for analysis that would shape American law for generations to come. 7 years of silence had ended, but 7 years of extraordinary service to justice would continue, now with the recognition and respect that such work had always deserved. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.